So one of the things we have to talk about when we talk about physiology is that physiology evolved. And basically, over evolutionary time, you have different environmental constraints that are causing different adaptations to be advantageous. So we're going to look at the evolutionary tree, but we're going to look at it from a physiologist's perspective. Our story is first going to start with our common ancestor, which is this choanoflagellate. And the choanoflagellate is a single-celled organism that typically lives solo. Eventually, some of these organisms are going to get an idea. They're going to start living in a colony. And the colony is going to have benefits to them because now that there are other organisms around, their predation risk is lower. It's easier to sort of do things together and help each other out. And that sort of drives the start of multicellularity. It's important to mention that some of these critters are going to continue to kick it old school in the single-celled fashion, and others are going to adopt that multicellularity. That multicellularity creates paves the way for what we call tissues. Tissues are cells that work together on the same function. And since these cells work together, that means that they have to communicate with one another. So this kind of drives the idea of cellular communication. One cell communicating with another, which often occurs through chemicals. So basically, even if an animal is multicellular, it may not have tissues because those cells may not be communicating to work together on the same function. And you might wonder what kind of animal doesn't have tissues. Well, one example is the sponge. And sponges have two different types of cells. They have a choanocyte, which looks a lot like the choanoflagellate, and an amoebocyte. Each of these cell types does its own function. The choanocytes make water flow through the sponge. The amoebocytes help to digest stuff, but they're not communicating with one another, and that's why sponges don't have tissues. Now, something really cool happens when we have more than one of something. Remember that the original colony was made up of like cells. Well, when you're living together and you're kind of helping each other out, if everybody's alike, that means some of you guys can specialize. And if some of them can specialize, then they can develop a slightly different function. This is much less risky when you have a backup, because that way the backup will always work, and the new one, if it breaks, it won't break the entire system. This is what we call duplication leading to specialization. Now, when we look sort of more long term, one thing we see coming up a lot in evolution is the idea of segmentation. And segmentation is a duplication event. I like to think of it like nature's cut and paste. Basically, it's the copying of like things together. And then over time, some of those may specialize. Think of what does segmentation look like? Well, it's easy to think of when you think of a segmented animal like a worm. They've got a bunch of segments, they're almost identical. And when we look at insects, we can kind of see that too, where the abdomen has sort of distinct segments in it. Well, it happens in other animals as well. You can look at the snake and see the ribs are repeating. That's segmentation. And if you think about muscle structure, if you think about a six-pack, that's a segmentation event as well, as would be your spinal column, your vertebrae. So just like in life, when you end up getting more stuff, you need to start thinking about where to put it and how to put it together. And that brings us to the next sort of physiological evolution, which is symmetry. Some animals have no symmetry, like sponges. But some have either a bilateral symmetry, where the right and left sides are the same, or radial symmetry, where you can cut them in any direction and you will end up with two equal halves. Symmetry might not seem like a big deal, but it actually is. If you think about it, once something has a right side and a left side, then it kind of needs to have a front and a back as well. And this happened with the evolution of body structure. Once things had bilateral symmetry, it paved the way for having a head or cephalization. And what that means is that now, since the item will be moving in one direction, it makes more sense for it to have its sensors in the direction it's moving, basically in the front, so it doesn't bump into things. And this leads to the nervous system moving up there, which leads to the animal having a head. And once we settle into having a front and a back or a head and a butt, now we have to think about the order that these things develop in. And this is what separates the protostomes from the deuterostomes. Protostomes develop their mouth first and later develop their anus. So basically, they go a top-down approach. The deuterostomes develop the anus first and then develop the mouth. So they go bottom up. Guess what we are? We're deuterostomes. Some of us are buttholes, and some of us grow out of it. Because of how the body develops, this has an interesting impact, and that's that it affects where the nervous system is. So the deuterostomes have a dorsal nerve cord, and the protostomes have a ventral nerve cord, and that sort of impacts where structures are, which has lasting impacts on some physiology. Now, when we start with the protostomes, these are all invertebrates, and those of us invertebrate physiologists, we love to divide invertebrates into two categories, squishies and crunchies. They're divided into the Lophotrochozoa and Ecdysozoa. Ecdysozoa are your insects and crustaceans, anything with an exoskeleton. Lophotrochozoa is a little bit more of a grab bag. It includes the cephalopods as well as worms. When we look at the other side of this, we have the deuterostomes. And deuterostomes develop their anus first and their mouth second. So deutero, two, stome, stomach. One of the categories of these animals is the echinoderms, sea urchins and sea stars. These seem like they don't belong, and they're really in this category because of a larval state. The other ones are going to seem like they go there much more readily. It starts with the fish. And basically, these can be divided into cartilaginous fishes, which are your sharks and rays, and bony fish. Once we look at bony fish, those become an ancestor to land animals. Basically, there's increasing evolutionary pressure to adapt and take over a new niche, which is land. And in order for animals to do that, there are a lot of adaptations that need to occur. Now, all of a sudden, they need a structure that can hold up to gravity. So they need bones, and strong ones at that. It's really good if you're going to live somewhere to be able to locomote. So this drives the evolution of limbs. If you're going to live in an environment that is where you're surrounded by air, it's a good idea to be able to breathe air. So this drives the evolution of lungs. And all of these things together happen multiple times, which means that multiple times in evolutionary history, there was pressure to develop these traits. When we look at structures in an evolutionary sense, we come up with sort of two terms, analogy and homology. Homology means that the things evolved from the same background. So when we think of a bony fish moving onto land and having to evolve to move onto land, you can kind of get the idea of where its fin would become a front limb. And that could be a very different front limb in a human than it is in a four-legged animal. All of those structures are called homologous because they come from the same background. Now, since the same evolutionary pressure has caused certain adaptations, these may come from different backgrounds but end up having the same function. An example is flight. Flight evolved multiple times, and that means that there are multiple animals with wings. But I don't think you would argue with me if I told you that bats, birds, and insects are not related very closely. It's not like flight developed and then the divergence happened. It happened much, much earlier with insects back with the protostomes and the deuterostomes, and they developed flight, and the mammals and birds are developing it later. It's worth stating that these analogous events often happen because the same pressure is present, or sometimes the same beneficial conditions. We'll get into it later in the course, but it turns out that the oxygen content of the environment had a lot to do with when flight developed evolutionarily, and it developed evolutionarily 4 or 5 times. Now, once animals move on to land, there are even more pressures that are causing more adaptations. And depending on when they moved on land, we'll see sort of different traits arising. Keep in mind that you can't really get rid of traits very easily. There's something that once they develop, it's kind of hard to hit the undo button. Now, later in this course, you're going to learn more about the differences that happened when animals moved on land. But the important thing now is to understand sort of these big divisions from single cell to multi-cell, animals with tissues, animals without tissues, symmetry, protostomes, deuterostomes, because your book is going to go from talking about sponges to talking about jellyfish. And it's really good to understand where the evolutionary differences occurred, because sometimes there's a primitive structure that had to adapt as well. So for now, as you think about this video and as you kind of distill this content to start making your project, I want you to think about the major physiological traits that have developed and when those developed. And you might even think about what were the pressures that caused those to develop.